To start with understanding any country, it is best to look at the setting in which the nation began. So despite the fact that this is about the American Empire, the start of this series must happen before America began. Where then to start? The best place to start for understanding the American Empire as we know it through the game will cut off much of North American history. The Bering Strait, Cahokia, and Leif Erikson are all important for the history of North America, but for the history of the United States, the influence these events, people, and places have is negligible. This narrowing of history seems strange since this is supposed to be about the American Empire, but I will remind the viewers that what civilization calls the American Empire should probably be called the United States Empire instead. I also freely admit, though, that American Empire sounds so much better. Thus, the study begins with the colonialism of the 4 European nations that settled in what is now the United States: England, France, Spain, and the Netherlands. With apologies to Russia, CivHistory acknowledges you colonized Alaska, but not for a while, so be patient, you'll get your turn. In 1565, the Spanish became the first European nation, at least that we know of, looking at you Nordic countries, to settle in what would later become the United States. Spain, at this point, had established a strong presence in the Caribbean, Central America, and South America. But the Spanish colonies, known as New Spain, never settled in North America as much as they did elsewhere. Maybe because there just wasn't enough gold, or because the Fountain of Youth had been a wild goose chase and they just weren't as successful as Tulio and Miguel at finding El Dorado. For whatever reason, Spain never had many colonists in the future United States. The largest colony the Spanish founded in the United States was Santa Fe, and the city, if you can call it that, only had around 3,000 settlers during Spanish rule. The Spaniards that did settle in the area were generally parts of 2 groups: conquistadors, looking for gold, and religious groups hoping to convert the Indian tribes to Catholicism. Neither group was particularly successful, since, as previously mentioned, the American South had little, if any, gold. Not that that deterred English colonists later on, Virginia. In addition, while the Catholic missions that were set up were generally more successful than the Protestant attempts later on, they were thwarted by a couple of measures. One being the fluidity of American Indian belief systems, meaning they adopted parts of Catholic belief and adapted it to fit their existing religious structure, which clashed the monotheistic beliefs of many Europeans. Second, tales of the atrocities perpetrated by the Spanish had reached the Indians of the Southwest, and while there were some people that spoke out against these practices, such as Bartolomé de las Casas, the person historians give in every argument of, hey, the colonizing Spanish weren't all terrible, some tribes even had first-hand experience fighting with and against the Spanish, and saw the capabilities of the Spanish come wartime, and their seeming lack of qualms about killing Indians. Third, and perhaps most devastating to Catholic efforts to convert the Indians, was disease, which is estimated to have killed around 90% of the American Indian population between 1492 and 1620. The spread of disease certainly gave the Spanish and the other European countries, because let's be fair, it wasn't just the Spanish, a devastating impact on the United States' future lands. In addition, the Spanish brought over domesticated animals, crops, and grass that have now taken over much of the United States. Likewise, the influence Spanish Catholicism had on specifically Mexico would become extremely relevant before and during the Mexican-American War, but we'll cover that at a later date. Therefore, it is evident that despite the low number of Spaniards colonizing the U.S., Spanish influence was pervasive and continues up to the present day. Spanish roots in southern cuisine is hard to miss, as spices used in Mexican food such as oregano and coriander did not originate in America. In addition, dairy products and meats such as pork and cheese were uncommon or did not exist in America before the Spanish brought them over. And with the melding of these foods with native spices and dishes came the deliciousness that is Mexican food. The Spanish language also is seen throughout the U.S. from the states Colorado, Florida, Montana, and Nevada, whose names are all Spanish in origin, which is generally unsurprising, except Montana, which, while it was at one point part of New Spain when Spain owned the Louisiana Territory, Montana wasn't settled at that time. Also, why isn't Montana pronounced Montana? It makes no sense if it's supposed to be Spanish. Moving on from that, the language can be seen from names of places such as Los Angeles and the Rio Grande to outdated memes. Spanish influence is alive and well in the United States, but Spain was not the only colonizing European nation of the time. In many ways, France mimicked Spain during the time period when the Americas were being settled, at least in regards to being a European Catholic power that peaked in strength in the New World in the 17th and early 18th centuries. France did vary from Spain, though, in a couple particular ways. Firstly, with the geographic location of the French, who controlled the Louisiana territory of the modern-day U.S. Secondly, their interactions with Indians were generally more cooperative than their fellow nations, and thus gained more success diplomatically and religiously with the Indians, a fact that English colonies found extremely frightening. Much like many of the other nations, French settlers came generally for two purposes: to get rich through trade, since they figured out the whole no-gold situation much faster than the English and Spanish, and the Jesuits who attempted to spread Catholicism. Like Spain, France's bigger colonial settlements were not in the future United States, apart from New Orleans, but the French maintained influence through Indian relations and the fur trade. Since both of these areas of influence do not exist in the modern United States, though, French influence is harder to see, with New Orleans continuing to be the exception with its distinctly French roots. France does have some state names, though, Louisiana and Vermont. People also argue that there are French roots in the names Wisconsin and Maine, but those claims are disputed. Their influence being not as direct on U.S. history makes some discount French involvement, but perhaps French influence was more indirect and came about mainly because of France's influence on another one of the colonial nations, England. The Netherlands? Yes, the Netherlands. Were you expecting me to talk about a different European nation? The Netherlands' presence in the United States was rather short-lived, as their control over the colony of New Netherland lasted only about 40 years before it was captured by the English. Founded as a trading outpost for the lucrative fur trade in the Northeast, New Amsterdam, now known as New York City, was the main center for Dutch fur trade in addition to Fort Orange and Wiltwyck, now known as Albany and Kingston. The brief presence of the Netherlands in the future state of New York did not spread too much influence over the region, but as historians have pointed out, Kingston retains Dutch aspects such as the architecture in the Old Dutch Church. In addition, the legend of Santa Claus was brought over to the United States by Dutch settlers in New York, though at the time he was depicted a little differently. However, in 1664, not long after the founding of Wiltwyck, the Dutch and English were at war and New Netherland was captured by the English. It probably would have been harder for them if the Dutch had actually placed a military or navy in New Netherland. Lastly comes England, the most dominant and impactful nation on the United States, beginning with the failed colony at Roanoke and continuing with Jamestown and Plymouth. The English were unique in several regards while holding colonial power. The extensive territorial holdings and significant population of England in the colonies led to the forming of distinctive cultures within their various holdings, including a developing difference in culture between the northern and southern colonies, a divide that would not end with colonial rule. From the primary language of the United States to the classical ideas of republicanism that were essential in the founding of the United States, English influence is everywhere in the United States. Politically, republicanism and representative government were concepts inspired by similar or the exact same systems existing previously or currently in England. Economically, the beliefs of mercantilism, which operates under the assumption that the economy is a zero-sum game, and the beliefs of John Locke on the matters of property had great effect on the colonies. Mercantilism caused the colonies to become adept with resource production and discouraged the colonists away from manufacturing, which led to manufacturing being one of the first areas of revolt in the colonies. John Locke's property ideals can be seen at work with clashes over property ideas between English colonists and American Indians. Socially and culturally, much of the social elite took inspiration from England. Many southern mansions were designed to mimic English architecture, and some wealthier families had agents stationed in England to inform them of the current styles. Religiously, Protestant rhetoric was common in the charters for the more religious colonies, Massachusetts especially. In the South, the Protestant ideals were not as common, but they were there still. Exceptions and differences existed with regards to all of the aforementioned categories, but on the whole, the colonies that would become the United States were copying England at almost every turn. They say mimicry is the highest form of flattery, but the colonies may have gone a little overboard with their flattery, though it turned out well sometimes. All this European influence prompts the questions: why and how did the United States become an independent nation? The answers to those questions are complex, but in general, the forces behind the movement include religion, riches, and rivalry. The same forces that have been discussed in this video. And they will continue to the next video on the war that may be the most confusingly named war in history, the 7 Years' War. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it.